is probably close to the kinds of Aramaic that influenced late Biblical Hebrew. I thought it would be interesting to give an overview of recent scholarship, including my own, on the tense aspect mood system to see whether any connections with late Biblical Hebrew become apparent. Biblical Aramaic has three main tenses, at least three we'll discuss today: the perfect, the participle, and the imperfect. And for the most part, these map to past, present, and future time reference, respectively. So we have perfect forms like nefkat, it was issued, participles like ana chazeh, I see, and imperfect forms like yitremeh, he shall be thrown. Occasionally, however, we find perfect forms used in the present or future as well, according to common translations at least, such as yid'et, for I know, or yehivat, it shall be given. The participle can also be used in past and future contexts, such as salkan, they came up, or tardin, they shall drive away. And to complicate matters even further, the imperfect not infrequently occurs in past and present contexts, such as yikum, he got up, and yuchal, he can. Obviously, tense alone is not enough to explain the uses of the different verbal forms in Biblical Aramaic. And many scholars have tried to make sense of this verbal system, limiting ourselves to important studies from this century. First of all, there's the big study by Holger Zella from 2004, who investigates the tense aspect mood system of Imperial Aramaic as a whole, in which he includes Biblical Aramaic. A few years later, another study appeared by Michael B. Shepard, who takes a completely different approach and analyzes text jara as the conditioning factor that determines which tense is predominantly used. There's a lot of uses that are not explained by this, and in the absence of a formal definition of genres like narrative and discourse, this account leaves a lot of questions unanswered, and it has had a bit of a mixed reception. But shortly afterwards, the third major work appeared. That's Tarsi Lee's The Verbal System of the Aramaic of Daniel, which has a more restricted focus than Zella 2004, only focusing on the book of Daniel. And it takes as its framework grammaticalization theory. So Lee is very attuned to how one and the same form or construction can shift in meaning over time, and sometimes attest various uses that show how it changed over time. Over the past couple of years, more restricted studies have appeared in journals. Sashko Anderson has several co-authored papers on Biblical Aramaic, including one in which the authors take Tarsi Lee's conclusions about the perfect in Daniel and check them for the Aramaic of Ezra, and a more recent study on performatives in Biblical Aramaic. Dan Carver has been working on the Biblical Aramaic verb with a study on the mysterious future use of the perfect in one verse, and more recently, a more elaborate study on uses of the imperfect in the past tense. And about a week ago, I found out that Andrew Daniel has a forthcoming paper, which shares part of its title with my talk, which I did not know when I submitted the title. And that's an in-depth study of the imperfect overall, in which he argues that all of its uses can be explained as modal. So the part of the title that my talk shares with Andrew Daniel's forthcoming paper is a new synthesis. And that's really what the field of the Biblical Aramaic verb system needs at this point, synthesizing the different findings from previous work and fitting them into one coherent whole. So that's what I've tried to do, with the added aspect that there are two methodological principles that I've applied that previous scholars have not. I've argued in a recent Vetus Testamentum article that the language of the Biblical Aramaic consonantal text is rather different than that of the reading tradition as reflected in the Masoretic vocalization and divergent K'rei forms. So in order to reach a coherent description of Biblical Aramaic grammar, we have to keep these separate. And in this talk, I'll just be focusing on the consonantal text. even though I've provided the forms with Masoretic vocalization, and I'll read them out like that just for convenience. So for example, if we have an attestation like this, and the king saw chazeh, the back of the hand, consonantal spelling chet zayin he is ambiguous. It could either be a perfect chaza or it could be a participle chazeh as it's vocalized. So I've excluded ambiguous forms, consonantally ambiguous forms like these from the initial analysis in order to keep the data unambiguous. And the other point is that rather than taking Biblical Aramaic as one undifferentiated corpus, I try to take into account that the text has a history and that some verses are older than others. And for Daniel, this is based on a forthcoming monograph on the textual history of the Aramaic chapters of Daniel, which, for example, solves the problem of the future perfect in Daniel 7, verse 27, that Dan Carver has recently studied. And the kingship will be given, Yehivat, to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. This is how it reads in its current context. But in my view, this is part of a strand of the chapter that uses past tense narration. So originally, this form Yehivat would have expressed a past event was given, and only due to different stages of editing does it now end up in a context where it seems to be a future, even though that doesn't actually tell us anything about the verb. Zella and Lee both identify quite a large amount of redundancy in the Biblical Aramaic verbal system, multiple meanings being able to express by different competing constructions. So one question we could ask is if this new approach supports that, or whether we might reach an analysis where there's a one to many maybe, but at least one dedicated construction for every combination of tense, aspect, and mood. We'll go through the three main tenses, so-called, in order, starting with the perfect, then moving to the participle, and finally the mysterious imperfect. Most of the time, the perfect expresses past perfective events. This is the vast majority of cases, such as at that moment the modal was fulfilled, Safat, over Nebuchadnezzar. Zella and Lee also identify anterior as use of the perfect. So like the English perfect, as in the golden vessels that they had taken, Hanpiku, from the palace. However, an anterior automatically implies a past perfective event that took place before the reference time. So since these are not morphologically or syntactically distinguished from the past perfective usage, I don't think we have to see this as a separate use of the perfect. This also can count as past perfective. And Lee has identified one case of the perfect which is used modally in a conditional clause, unless we found hashkachna, something on him in the law of his God. And it's actually quite normal for conditionals to have an association with past tense verb forms in languages of the world. So I think we can also fit this under the larger umbrella of past perfective. Just as another note, here and there, I've provided references. I've tried to indicate, especially when I disagree with other scholars, but I haven't always indicated the many places where I do agree with them. A few uses that have been posited for the perfect that I would argue against are stative and performative. The biblical Hebrew perfect can express these meanings, but I don't think this is attested for biblical Aramaic, although other scholars have identified these uses. So this form Yid 8 from the example slide at the beginning, in context, this can be analyzed at least as well as reflecting a past perfective event. I have learned, I came to know that there is a spirit of holy gods in you, and not an ongoing state, I now know. And we can contrast this with contexts where there is clearly a state of reading where the participle yada is used. And in this case, the participle is consonantally unambiguous as a participle. Lee identifies a number of perfects as stative pasts, which is why he analyzes the perfect as a simple past, which is undifferentiated for aspect. But I don't think the examples really hold up. One of them is here, and he saved his servants who trusted, hitrachitsu, in him. In context, this is not about an ongoing permanent state of trust, but about a one-off act of demonstrated trust. In other words, it's a perfective event, and we can just analyze this as a past perfective, like the vast majority of perfects. And the same goes for the other examples Lee gives of a perfect yechil, which is not about a permanent ability of someone that's reflected here, but one-off demonstrations of someone's ability to do something. So we might translate that as proved able. There is the exception of hava. The perfect hava can either be perfective, he became, it became, or a stative, it was. For a copular verb like that, I don't think that's very unexpected. And I'm, of course, perfectly fine accepting that in this case, the perfect does express a state. And pretty much everyone sees some perfects in Biblical Aramaic as expressing a performative, so used to perform speech acts. Most of the examples occur in the phrase "Nili Samet." A decree is hereby issued by me, if you take it as a performative, or has been issued by me. But nearly all of these attestations occur in letters, which are not actually the decree that is referred to. So I don't think we should take these as performatives. I hereby decree, but as in the writer telling the audience, I have decreed something at a separate occasion. The one exception is in Daniel 3, verse 29, where we do have a speaker saying, "Nili Samet" at this moment. But we have other grounds to see this verse as a later interpolation. So I think we can analyze the use of the verb here as a pseudo-biblical Aramaicism, if you will. I think an editor encountered this phrase in other parts of the corpus and used it here more or less incorrectly. So technically, this would be one performative use of the perfect, but I don't think that was a regular value of the verb. Normally, performatives and other presents are expressed by the participle. By the participle, with that term, I follow Lee's identification that the passive participle katil doesn't behave like a verb. It's distinct from the active participle, including the T-stem participle. It behaves more like an adjective, so we won't take that into consideration here. When I say the participle, I just mean actives and T-stems. So this is what is used for the actual present, including the actual cases of performatives. You, O God of my fathers, I thank, mahodeh, and praise, meshabbach. Progressive presents, they are rebuilding Banayin, the rebellious and evil city. Stative presents, which do not see, la chazayin, do not hear, la sham'in, and do not know anything, v'la yad'in. For some of these verbs, you could debate whether they're statives or habituals. And habitual present is also clearly attested as a use of the participle. He makes kings pass away, mahadeh malchin, and he raises up kings, mahakim malchin. Outside the present, the participle can be used with an auxiliary hava or without an auxiliary. And the uses without an auxiliary, with just the bare participle, have a number of marked aspects, I'd say, marked aspectual uses that form a kind of grammaticalization path. So that's interesting to see. I'd say that the path starts with the use as a near future, like velach tardim, meaning and they're going to drive you away. So this refers to events in the more or less near future. And we could also analyze this as a present tense with a perspective aspect, something that at the present time is going to happen. From there, the use of the bare participle could be extended to the perspective past, such as v'yachla, and it was about to vanquish when the Ancient of Days came. So the vanquishing was not yet complete, but it was going to happen soon. A perspective past then easily leads into an inchoative past, which is also identified by Lee, but I identify more cases of it than he does, such as here, fingers of a human hand appeared and started writing, chatvan. And the line between an inchoative and an iterative is sometimes hard to draw. There are also some cases where I think we're unambiguously dealing with an iterative, so the repetition of the same action over a certain period of time, such as here. Then the magicians, etc., each came in, alin, and I would tell amar ana them the dream, but they would not inform me la mahodein li of its interpretation. With the auxiliary hava, we see that the imperfective uses of the participle that are common in the present are just preserved, but now they can be transported into the past or into the future, depending on the form of hava that's used. So most of the examples here are past. Here we have a past progressive. After 12 months, he was walking, Mahalei Chava, on the royal palace of Babylon. We find statives, Vahavat Batla, and it lay idle. And habituals, Bihavat Save, Have Katel, he would kill whomever he wanted. And here's an example of a future habitual. And whoever does not keep La Leve Aved, the law of your God and the law of the king, must diligently be brought to justice. Dina leheve mit aved minneh. That leaves us with the imperfect. Everybody agrees that the imperfect expresses the future tense, and the holy ones of the Most High will receive Yikabbalun, the kingship, and will hold on to Yachsanun, the kingship, forever. It also expresses deontic modality, as is not unheard of for future tenses. It's another common correlation between tense and modality in languages of the world, as in Shlam Chon Yisgeh, may your well-being increase. And then there's a bunch of attestations that I would like to give the label of subjunctive, which is a purposefully vague way of saying that they're used in subordinate clauses, adverbial clauses. It seems to be a syntactic conditioning of the use of the imperfect. So here we have a purpose clause, for instance, and this has been studied in depth, for instance, especially by Dan Carver and Andrew Daniel in their recent papers. And he asked of the king that he give, the yintain, him time. Here we have a relative clause. There is no other who could relate it, the chavinnah, to the king. And this also accounts for, this is one way at least of accounting for one of the most difficult past tense uses of the imperfect. Then the king, getting up, yakum, at daybreak, at dawn, went to the lions in haste. Even though there's no explicit marking, no formal marking of the subordination here, the use of the imperfect shows that the getting up is subordinate here to the main event, which is expressed with the perfect azal. Besides these uses, there's also a number of contexts, fairly small number of passages where, sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. Can you all still see my screen?
Yes.
Good. Where I do think that the imperfect is used as an indicative, imperfective past tense. These are a few separate scenes, so I'll give you examples from every scene and you can maybe help me think of what to call these. One of them occurs in the description of one of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. The tree grew big and strong with two perfect verbs, and its height reached towards the sky, yimte. And here I'd say that the use of the imperfect shows that it's not a one-off event. The sky was not actually reached, but the tree continues to metaphorically stretch out its arms towards the sky. It's an ongoing event, and that's why the imperfective is used. Later on in the same story, we have a number of verbs like, and he ate yechul, grass like cattle, and his body was drenched, yitztaba, by the sky's dew. Here too, this is an event which is not one-off, and the end is left out of view, so imperfective. And in the Aramaic apocalypse, the scene with the Ancient of Days is described, or it's said of the Ancient of Days that 1,000 served him, and 10,000 stood before him. Same kind of description of an activity that takes energy, so it's not a passive state, but it's not finished. It's not a rapid repetition either. And of course, other scholars have explanations for these forms, and mostly they class these under other categories that we've seen. But I think that the use of the imperfect here is not just, doesn't just show a formal difference, but there's also really a semantic difference that we can identify here. So I think these are really different in meaning from progressives, where something is ongoing at a certain moment when something else happens. That's not really the case with these examples. Unlike the habituals that are expressed with participle and hava, these do not express a typical action that occurs in a given situation. There's no trigger here, no condition that sets off the event. And I wouldn't want to call these iteratives either, although they might be close to them, but compared to the cases that just use the participle, I don't think the focus is on repetition one after the other here as much. It's just an undifferentiated mass of activity. So that concludes our survey of the different tenses and the different uses of it I identify for them. And that does in fact leave us with a situation where we have only one construction per tense aspect mood combination. In the indicative, it looks like this. For the past tense, we have a spectral split between the perfective, which is expressed by the perfect tal, and the imperfective, expressed by the imperfect, yiktul. The present tense is expressed by katel, the participle, and the future is expressed by the imperfect, yiktul. The marked aspects of perspective, inchoative, and iterative are expressed regardless of tense by the bare participle katel. And the imperfective aspects that are most common in the present, of the progressive, the stative, and the habitual, can be converted to past or future by using the participle and the auxiliary, which is either put after the participle, and then we get katel hava or katel lehve, depending on the tense, or before it, hava katel or lehve katel. And on the dimension of modality, we have a perfect katal that can be used for hypotheticals, or at least it is once, while the imperfect yiktul is used to express deontic modality and in a number of subordinated contexts. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your criticism and questions and any links with late biblical Hebrew that might have occurred to people. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Benjamin. If you'd like to write me on the chat your questions, I'll call on you, or if you want to raise your hand. Benjamin, can you stop sharing your screen so that we can see many people? Okay, great. Questions, please.
I see that Ohad raised his hand.
Okay. Ohad.
Hi, Shalom. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, Shalom, Benjamin. Thank you for this interesting presentation and for the courage to enter the minefield of verbal tense system. Only one methodological note for future presentation. It is very important for dealing with TMA to quote more than one sentence, because most of the information is outside the boundaries of the sentence, and sometimes it is hard to follow the argumentation, even though it was very clear and very you presented very well. It is very important. Sometimes it is even 6, 7 sentences before or after the sentence that is needed to be quoted. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I completely agree, of course, and I'll be the first to say that I don't think I proved anything with this talk. Given the limitations of time, I hoped more to kind of just state my conclusions, and I have something on paper where I do discuss much more of the context, because so for now I'm making a big ask of you all to trust my interpretations, but of course for the real discussion you need more context.
Okay, Ron, I see you've raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Benjamin, for your wonderful paper. I just like to ask for a little more context. What differences do you find between your TAM analysis of Biblical Aramaic with Old Aramaic and wider Reichs Aramaic?
Yeah, good
Are there
question.
any significant differences in these main axes and stuff?
Yes. So these uses of the imperfect, and especially in the past tense, are something with a few parallels in Qumran Aramaic and not really anything else where. So that's also why they're so hard to make sense of. Depending on if you take them as imperfectives or not, we might have some other attestations in Old Aramaic, but for the most part, I think what makes the Biblical Aramaic verbal system so hard to analyze is that it's transitional between systems we understand better. This kind of middle to late Aramaic system like Syriac has, where tense is really very prominent, and a more classical Semitic-like system that might still be reflected in Old Aramaic. And of course, I limited myself for this analysis to Biblical Aramaic, and that leads me to some other conclusions than Xela, for instance, who bases some of his conclusions for Biblical Aramaic on attestations in Imperial Aramaic. I didn't do that here.
Thank you.
Harold, please.
Thank you, Benjamin. In your previous work, you identified some interesting cases where the vocalization and the consonantal texts might point to different usages. Can you relate these developments or what happens there to the system you presented now? Can you give some examples?
Absolutely. Great question. Thank you so much. I couldn't discuss those due to time limitations, but yes, so if I say the reading tradition treats these differently, then what's going on? Well, one very clear example is with verbs of speech. Everyone who knows Biblical Aramaic will be familiar with the phrase aneva amar, which in the reading tradition has two participles. And in the consonant, except when it's not masculine singular, if it's plural or if it's feminine, then most of the time we see that to answer or to speak ana is a perfect, and then saying is a participle. So most of the time in the plural we have ano v'amrin. And the reading tradition seems to have leveled a participle wherever it could, whenever the consonantal text was ambiguous, but not where it would go against the consonantal text. And this matches the fact that another late addition to Daniel 3 has a case where both of the plural forms, you know, well, Harold, we've discussed this, have a participle. So based on this vocalization, it seems to me that in the language of the reading tradition, there was a tendency to use the participle for verbs of speech to introduce direct speech, which you can understand because there's always a fuzzy line between where the direct speech starts and where the reference time shifts. So it's also interesting to note that the verb for to shout is always vocalized, as far as I could tell, as kare, as a participle. And it's always the expression kare b'chayu. I don't know if that's important at all, but I think that might suggest that originally a perfect kara was intended there as well. So a watcher descended from heaven and he kara b'chayu, he called out with strength, but then because the consonantal text is ambiguous there, the readers were free to turn that into a participle, and that becomes kare b'chayu everywhere as well. I think that would be one of the clearest examples where you see them go their own way. And yeah, there's some other things with perfects and participles, but it depends on how much you would want the participle to be progressive or not. Yeah.
Okay, unfortunately, our time is up.
Oh, I hope Noam's question in a chat maybe or something, because I'm sure it's fascinating.
Sorry, Noam. You'll have to wait till later. Also, I have a question or two for you, but I'll write you separately. Anyway, thank you very much, Benjamin, for an excellent lecture. Our second